After Action, The True Story of a Cobra Pilot's Journey by Dan Sheehan. Chapter 3. A month after leaving San Diego, the USS Tarawa arrived off the coast of East Timor. I stood on the flight deck of a helicopter carrier in a foul mood as the night sky melted into shades of blue. The high mountains of the tiny nation stepped forward out of the blackness, and the scene I would have ranked as the most beautiful sunrise I'd ever seen if I'd been paying attention. The 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit, Special Operations Capable, had orders to provide humanitarian assistance to the United Nations force struggling to stabilize and rebuild the small country. After choosing independence from Indonesia, deadly riots had destroyed much of East Timor's infrastructure and killed over 1,000 of its citizens. The UN troops were dealing with a shadowy guerrilla presence, bent on punishing those who had the temerity to desire freedom and they lacked helicopter support. That's where we came in. The plan was relatively straightforward. Our medium and heavy lift helicopters would sling load tons of construction materials and deliver them to the remote mountainside landing zones near the villages that needed them. 3 days of flying, then we would leave. On the surface, it sounded simple. What made it a little more interesting were the violent pro-Indonesian militias operating in the thick forest that blanketed the mountainous country. They were the ones who had killed over 1,400 people, and they would take a dim view of us trying to help the survivors. Therein lay the cause of my distraction that September morning in 2000. To protect our transport helicopters from ground fire, we would escort them into and out of the zones with our 4 Cobras and 2 working Hueys. With full cans of 20mm in the nose and 14 high-explosive rockets under our wings, we were well prepared to deal with the possible threat. I'd slept like crap the night before, scarcely able to believe my good luck. Less than a month into my first float, and I was about to fly a fully armed gunship around a sovereign nation trolling for a fight. Are you fucking kidding me? Hell yeah. Despite tossing and turning all night, I leapt out of bed that morning like a 10-year-old on Christmas, only to find that Santa had dropped a turd in my stocking. The lineup had changed. Instead of flying, I'd be on standby, relegated to sitting on the bench while other pilots crossed into the unknown. It made sense to keep a section of gunships in reserve in case they were needed to respond to a crisis, but not mine. Fuck! Awake and fully pissed, I went up to the flight deck. I had to escape the excited chatter of my squadron mates as they prepared to launch. I walked over to the Cobra parked on spot 4, thankful it was dark enough that nobody could see me pouting as I caressed the dew-covered rocket pod underneath the bird's wing and engaged in gratuitous self-pity. The scuff of a boot against the flight deck alerted me to the attack, but not in time. Massive ape arms crushed the breath from my lungs and lifted me off my feet. Freshly released anger drove a couple of quick elbows backward at my assailants' exposed ribs, and I was rewarded with a surprised grunt when they landed. The grip loosened completely and I dropped to the rough metal deck and moved away. Damn it, Teddy. You almost made me swallow my dip, I complained, spinning to face my friend. I was not surprised to find him grinning from ear to ear in the early light. A good friend of mine for years, Ted Treadwell, was a UH-1N Huey pilot in the squadron and also my roommate on the ship. Guess you shouldn't have been a daydreaming sucker, he answered, sounding more like Shaft than a white boy from Phoenix, and not at all apologetic. Our friendship was based largely on delivering and receiving physical punishment in various forms regardless of the company we found ourselves in. We provided a never-ending source of amusement for the rest of the squadron. You flying with Kid today? He asked, the ritual beating and insults over with for the time being. Kid was my boss and combat crew. Anytime we flew into situations that might involve shooting, we flew with our combat crew. The same pilots were always paired together for familiarity and efficiency. Nah, we're on standby. Just have to hope for some shit to go down, I replied, trying to hide my disappointment, but failing. Teddy gave an exaggerated ha-ha, mimicking Nelson's annoying laugh from The Simpsons. I was already reeling from being bumped off the schedule, and the same thing from any less of a friend would have really pissed me off. But coming from Teddy, all I could do was smirk. To get mad at him would only show weakness that he'd exploit mercilessly, and besides, I knew I was acting like a baby. I flipped him the bird as he turned and walked to his Huey. Try not to fuck anything up today, I called after him. Oh, I got this, he replied easily, returning my salute over his shoulder. Lucky fucker. I hope he doesn't get to do some shooting. I'll never hear the end of it. My prayers were answered and the day passed without incident. No militiamen were spotted and, with the exception of a load of loose roofing materials that got blown off the side of a mountain by a 46's downwash, everything went pretty smoothly. To my eager imagination, the absence of any violence today increased the chances that it would happen tomorrow. The militia would be expecting us. Again, I tossed and turned in my coffin-like bed and willed the night to pass quickly. I got up on the flight deck before dawn. This time, I had drawn my 9mm pistol, M16 rifle, and ammunition, and was in a much better mood. I put my kneeboard and maps into the front seat and pre-flighted the aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness. "Hey Shu, how's the bird look?" Kid joined me at the nose of our aircraft as I lay underneath the 20mm cannon, inspecting the cable attachments. "Good, sir. Nothing big," I answered, letting him know that I had conducted the pre-flight inspection and found nothing important amiss. There was always leaking fluid and minor gripes, but the main pieces were all there. It takes a lot of trust for one pilot to take another's word for the airworthiness of his aircraft, but that was the point of the combat crew configuration. Kid and I had built that trust over time. "Aye, Dent, let's do this," he responded as he climbed into the rear seat and started to strap in, his fake ghetto accent relieving some of the morning stress. Smiling, I took a final walk around the aircraft to ensure all the panels were tightly secured, put on my body armor and flight vest, and hopped into the front cockpit. Even with my combat gear on, I was perfectly sized for the seat at 150 pounds, 5'7". I wondered how the bigger guys did it. Perfectly sized or not, pilot comfort was not a strong consideration of the Cobra's designers. When we returned from the mission 8 hours later, I was thankful it was over. My back screamed in protest when I climbed stiffly out of the cockpit. The whole day had been a non-event. We'd found nothing threatening, but not for lack of looking. I spent 90% of the day with my face down in the targeting bucket, saluting the magnified optics along our route and into the various landing zones in the hope that I would spot someone with a weapon in the thick underbrush. That night, as I lay in my bunk, images of the day's flight were played against the back of my eyelids, an ocean of jungle tilting and vibrating as I probed lush foliage ineffectively with the optics. I'd been looking through a soda straw at a landscape that held thousands of possible hiding places. With the start, I realized that dumb luck, not my years of training and preparation, would determine if I would see a threat in time to do anything about it. There's almost no chance of me spotting someone before they shoot at us. Hadn't thought about that before. Training targets had always stood out clearly against the background. The sun was just above the horizon as we started the third and final day of operations in East Timor. The heat felt all the more oppressive because of the thick humidity and my face itched where sweat found the small cuts from my hasty shave. This would be our last day to search for a very elusive foe lurking in the thick forests of a picturesque island. I really hoped we would find them. Given the stories about the brutality of the pro-Indonesian militias that had beaten and murdered defenseless civilians, the thought of administering some high-explosive spankings was very attractive, although after the anticlimactic non-events of yesterday, I tried not to get too excited. It was hard to imagine that such a beautiful place had been the scene of violent and deadly riots just a short time ago, but I knew it had. Lena, then a squadron mate and not yet a love interest, had spent the day before in the capital, Dili. She brought back a horrifying tale from another squadron mate who was serving as liaison with the East Timorese air traffic controllers at the airport. When she told the story to a group of us over dinner, her sunburned face unconsciously betrayed emotions that she'd scrubbed from her voice. The villagers had taken refuge in their church. I don't know. I guess hoping that God would protect them when the militia attacked. When they came, they forced their way in, hacking and cutting the people with machetes before mounting the bell tower and tossing children from the top, like some kind of sick game. Then they left and disappeared into the trees, but not before setting fire to the place. She paused and drank half a glass of tea in one gulp. The rest of us listened and fiddled with our food uncomfortably. We had all spent years training to kill, but not like that. What she described was pure sadistic murder. When Drifty walked through the rubble 2 days ago, there were still teeth and bones lying in the ashes. Lena looked down at her plate without seeing it, adding quietly, "I wonder if they're ever going to pick them up." I had no answer for my friend. None of us did. Story, and her obvious discomfort of what she'd seen and heard ashore, infuriated me. I wanted to exact some sort of revenge for what had taken place here. I saw a chance to right an obvious wrong, and now I really, really wanted someone to pick a fight with me on today's flight. Once safely airborne and flying away from the ship, Kid passed me the controls in the front seat. Knowing that I would not fly at all once we got over land, I eagerly took the controls, listening to the sharp sound of Kid wrapping his hands against the rear canopy to verify he'd relinquished them. Small inputs urged the agile helicopter to maneuver easily behind Knuckles and Lucius, the pilots in the lead aircraft 500 feet in front of us. I drank in the striking scenery as we closed with the island at 120 knots, the deep blue of the ocean blurry beneath us, but stationary as it spread toward the green of the forests ahead. The large mountains, some almost 10,000 feet high, gained detail as we got closer. The cracks and crevices in the massive rock faces that exploded out of the low-lying hills and valleys were impressive and showcased the ruggedness that explained why our helicopters were needed to move supplies. There was simply no way to drive large trucks around the narrow ribbons of unimproved roads. If we didn't airlift the supplies, they'd never leave the port. Being the outstretched arms of a large statue of Jesus, I passed the controls back to Kid, smacking my hands on the canopy to punctuate the transfer. I lowered my head to look through the telescopic sight unit in front of me as things became serious in our cockpit. Our conversation had been a lively discussion of the pros and cons of the various girlfriends I'd had in San Diego. Although happily married, Kid lived vicariously through my single-guy adventures, but a noticeable shift took place as we got within small arms range of the deceptively peaceful hillsides. Without saying a word, both of us assumed a sterile cockpit where only mission-related communications were voiced. I pushed extraneous thoughts aside with practiced ease as my world shrank to the small scene visible through my magnified sights. Everything external to those crosshairs fell away. Last day, last chance to get some payback. Come on out, dickheads. We spent the morning conducting reconnaissance runs on the landing zones that would be used that day, probing the dense forest for signs of ambush preparations or other nasty surprises lying in wait for our transport helos. Each search turned up nothing of interest. We saw a UN food truck getting mobbed as the blue-helmeted troops delivered food supplies to a refugee camp, but other than that, the morning was pretty boring. After getting gas at a forward arming and refueling point, FARP, at Komodo Airfield near Dili, we headed back for what we knew would be our last flight over the island. The transport helicopters were almost finished with their runs, and soon we would all return to the ship, which by this time was already starting to move toward our next stop, Singapore. A sinking feeling of disappointment grabbed hold of me as we took off from the FARP. I had a nagging suspicion that the best opportunity of this deployment to get into a fight would come to nothing. The thought of the endless training exercises that would occupy the next 5 months did nothing to improve my mood. I hadn't come around the world just to train and hung all my hopes on this last mission. After another hour of scanning the vegetation for some tiny glints of a weapon, my disappointment was approaching despair. Kid and I acknowledged that we should just head back to the ship and be done with it. Our asses hurt from the hard armor plates barely concealed by our seat cushions. We were ready to call it a day. Knuckles, in the lead aircraft, decided to make one final run across to the northern landing zone before heading back to the ship. I felt I'd spent enough time staring fruitlessly through the magnified optics, so I took a break. Flight's pretty much over anyhow. 2 days to Singapore and beer. I sat back against my seat, taking my head out of the foam eyepieces and reveling in the cool feeling as the sweat evaporated from around my eyes. The tightness of my lower back released as I relaxed. The valley floor beneath us was a patchwork of planted fields separated by wide, rocky riverbeds. It was mesmerizing for my altitude of 2,000 feet, and I was enjoying the view. Clear of terrain. Kid quietly let me know he wasn't going to crash into a huge ridgeline looming in front of us. Roger, I replied, bored and tired. As we flashed across the dirt road that ran along the crest of the ridge, I scanned it reflexively, noticing a small cluster of buildings about a mile to our right, almost hidden in the trees. It took a second for what I saw to register on my mind. Something moving on the road. 2 men? Was one of them holding something, a weapon? I craned my neck for a second look, my despair instantly replaced by excited disbelief. I tried to verify what I thought I'd seen, but the jungle had swallowed them up again. What's up, Shu? Kid had seen my contortions in the front seat as I tried to look behind us. Not sure, I grunted, the effort of holding my twisted position making speech difficult. I got 2 probables on the road back there, 2 guys in the street, one with something over his shoulder. As soon as the words left my mouth, Kid ripped our aircraft over on its side. Pulling hard, he crossed behind Knuckles and called out over our interflight frequency. Kid's got tag lead, possible troops on the road at our 6 o'clock on top of the ridge. 2 came in response as Knuckles and Lucius acknowledged the alert. Seamlessly, they assumed the position of wingman and turned hard to stay with us. I was almost quivering with excitement. The 1s and 0s were lining up. These guys must be enemy. Our transport helicopters have been overflying this ridgeline for several days and will continue to do so until the end of the operation. They had unintentionally set up a predictable pattern that 2 men with weapons could easily exploit. Even a half-assed ambush with only 1 weapon could take down an aircraft, and the threat posed by 2 men demanded a response. I'll give you a good long run down the road to look for these guys. If you can determine they're hostile, then lead with the 20. I'll put rockets on top of your impacts. Kid finalized our attack plans over the ICS. "Roger," I replied. I sure as hell wasn't bored now. My mouth went dry as I realized that we were seconds from getting into a fight, but pushed thoughts of the unknown away. Just do your job. I chided myself for the brief loss of focus, then glanced down to verify the switches were set to fire the 20mm cannon. We were coming back around to the ridgeline about 3 miles from where the men were walking. Kid picked up the dirt road and followed it toward them 100 feet above the treetops while calling the attack formation over the radio. None of us had ever fired a shot in anger, and the excitement was growing quickly. I smashed my face against the foam eye cups of the targeting bucket as we rolled out, my right hand rapidly slewing the daytime optics ahead to where I thought the men would be. I was worried that they would have taken cover and disappeared from view. That's what I would have done. Then what? My concern abated when I spotted the two figures highlighted against the yellow dirt road. A reflexive flip of my left thumb selected high magnification, and their tiny images grew substantially underneath the targeting reticle at my sights. I got them. "Searching for weapons," I called out. The two figures shimmered like mirages as the bouncing of the helicopter made the sights shake and jump crazily. The guy on the left has something slung across his back, but what the hell is it? I couldn't make it out. My eyes felt like they were stretching as I sought a millisecond of clarity. I could definitely see the object, sticking out at an angle behind the man's head, but couldn't determine what it was. My mind raced. The size and shape seemed to indicate a rocket-propelled grenade, but I needed to be sure. I felt myself squeeze the left-hand grip hard. We were closing in rapidly and were uncomfortably close when the guy reached up over his shoulder to grab the object. His motions perfectly matched my perception of a fighter readying his RPG. "I got weapons," I blurted over the ICS. "Roger, master arm is armed," Kid replied as he threw the switch from standby to arm in the rear cockpit. Flipping that switch gave me the ability to engage the two men in our sights with just a squeeze of a trigger. We were within a mile now, and their actions told me they could see and hear us clearly. I was worried they would seize the chance to shoot first, but held my fire. My sights were too blurry. I just couldn't be certain that they were hostile, and damned the rough mountain air that bumped and jostled the helicopter erratically. In seconds, we would be upon them. The urge to open fire was becoming irresistible. My pulse was already racing at the thought that we were the target of an RPG. Now it went into overdrive as the man on the right brought the object from across his back down into both hands across his chest. His friend dropped to one knee in the middle of the dusty yellow road and raised an object up to his eyes. I couldn't see what it was, but it didn't matter. He was pointing it at me. Here we go. My reaction to the threatening motions of the men was ingrained by training and occurred without thought. A large part of my brain assumed the role of bystander as I made yes-no decisions at blinding speed and prepared to fire. Instantly, I was on the brink. My left hand had mashed the action bar to align the powerful cannon with my sights, and my index finger rested tightly against the hot trigger, already drawing up slack. A bright flash erupted from the face of the kneeling man. Firing? I began to tighten my finger in response, but something made me hesitate. I knew I'd seen a flash, but something didn't fit. The flash was white and quick, something I'd seen before, but not a weapon being fired. What the fuck is that? Feeling that something wasn't right exploded in my head, forcing me to hold my fire even though we were right on top of them. The sight steadied up for just a second as the two figures filled my viewfinder. The sudden clarity chilled me to the bone. "Abort! Abort! Abort!" I shouted. Kid repeated the command over the radio, informing Knuckles and Lucius to hold their fire. As I sat up, the master arm indicator in the front cockpit switched from armed to standby. I noted with relief that Kid had deactivated the firing circuits for all our weapon systems. Nothing was in danger of coming off our aircraft. Surprised to find I was holding my breath, I exhaled as we flew past the two men on the dusty road. Their actions and equipment were now clearly visible to my naked eye and obviously devoid of any hostile intentions. The small white flashes were separated by several seconds, enough time for the kneeling man's large camera to recharge its flash. The photographer's buddy, the man I thought was readying an RPG, was happily strumming his guitar with his head tilted back as he belted out a tune. They had no clue how close they'd come to getting blown to Kingdom Come, but I did. "Holy shit, we almost whacked Johnny Cash," Kid exclaimed incredulously. I smiled weakly in response. "Yeah, that would have been tough to explain away," I quipped. I kept my tone light in an attempt to hide the fact that I was a bit shaken. Only later would this occur to me. I had never really considered the thought process by which I would decide to open fire or not. All my training had been devoid of that decision. It had always been made before we took off. This was a new development and unwelcome. It wasn't just the introduction of a difficult question that had my head spinning. I had also come within a hair's breadth of totally fucking it up. My selection of the correct option, not to shoot to kill, was from fortuitous hesitation rather than skills I could rely on in the future. That disturbing realization did not sit well with me. At that moment, however, I stuffed the unease away as tactical lead passed back the knuckles and we resumed our mission. Nobody mentioned the close call as we searched for other targets for another hour before returning to the ship. When we landed, I didn't feel disappointed anymore over missing a fight. Instead, I felt relief. At least I hadn't fucked up. Back in San Diego 5 months later, my life reverted to training flights, trying to run Teddy over with my kayak while he surfed, and generally enjoying the bounty offered by Southern California. While the parties and shenanigans that had taken place during the deployment faded in my memory, those few seconds when we were bearing down on the two men in the street retained their razor-sharp focus. At first it seemed like just a good story to tell around the bar, the time we almost took out the East Timorese Johnny Cash, but the severity of the incident lingered in my thoughts. For the first time in my 4 years as a Marine, I got a hint of the enormous responsibility I'd nonchalantly assumed by becoming a Cobra pilot. Ever since I decided to serve, I assumed that someday I would be called to kill. I was ready for it, as ready as anybody could be. The training seemed so clear-cut. You kill enemy combatants, you don't kill civilians. I'd come uncomfortably close to making a mistake that would have not only killed 2 innocent men, but also ruined me. I was trained to kill, not murder. Every time I thought about how close I'd come to crossing that line, my blood ran cold. That thought was in my head several years later, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. The lesson I'd learned in East Timor had hardened into an impenetrable mental wall, forming the foundation of my personal preparation for the coming fight. That lesson was, the only thing I needed to worry about was being sure I only killed enemy combatants. As long as I did that, everything would turn out just fine.